Hello, this is day 44 and we have reached the little book of Haggai. Now we've actually met Haggai before. We met him in the book of Ezra when he makes a brief appearance and here he is again. And what happens in the book of Ezra is we get in narrative form the message, or at least part of the message that we have here in the writing prophet. So Haggai is writing then, you can hopefully deduce now, Haggai is writing after the return from exile. Return from Babylonian exile takes place, or the beginning of it takes place in 538. He is, we don't know much about him. We don't know whether he is one of the ones who came back from exile in the first kind of wave of returnees, or if he was one of the people who had stayed in the land. Some people think he was a priest because he has an emphasis on the holiness of God and on the law, but you know, that doesn't prove he was a priest. Lots of people felt that way and understood those things. So we know very little about him. And we also, as far as the record we have, his ministry only lasted a few months. So it begins, we can date it because it was given to, it's connected with the reign of the kings of Babylon and Persia. Sorry, not Babylon. So it begins on the first day of the 6th month, it says, in the 2nd year of Darius the king. And we can date that. That was the 29th of August, 520 BCE. And then we have another date on in verse 15 of chapter 1, which is the 24th day of the 6th month, which was the 21st of September the same year. And then in chapter 2 verse 1 he gets another vision on the 21st day of the 7th month, which was the 17th of October. And then we have 2 oracles delivered on the 24th day of the 9th month. That's in verses 15 and 20 of chapter 2, and that was the 18th of December 520. So it's rather delightful actually to be able to pin those prophecies quite so accurately. Now, so what is Haggai's message? Well, you may remember, actually, because this is what comes up in the book of Ezra. Haggai's message, at least the first part of his message, is to arouse an indolent people who have gone off the boil, and to tell them to get on with rebuilding the temple. Now, you may remember that there's a pause because of the opposition that is faced, and then kind of it feels like everyone goes off the boil a bit. And then Haggai turns up and stirs them up to action again, and they crack on and they finish the job. So here we are. Let's hear some of these little bits where we hear his message. Chapter 1, verse 2. Thus says the Lord of hosts, these people say that the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. Verse 4, is it a time for you yourselves to dwell in your panelled houses while this house lies in ruins? Consider your ways. You have sown much and harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. Why is that? I'm slightly paraphrasing now. Because of my house, this is verse 9, because of my house that lies in ruins, while each of you busies yourself with his own house. Therefore the heavens above you has withheld the dew, and the earth has withheld its produce. And so he calls for them to get on and rebuild the temple, and they do. In the second half of this book, we have an eschatological vision. Hopefully you know what I mean by eschatological now. And so he has a vision of a restored temple, which is filled with the glory of the Lord. Chapter 2, verse 7. I will shake all nations, says the Lord, so that the treasures of all nations shall come in, that is into the temple, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord of hosts. Now that is not a vision that has been realised yet. At no point yet have all the nations brought glory to the temple, have brought treasures to the temple. In fact, as we know, the temple no longer exists. I made a bit of a point when we looked at the book of Ezra that when this second temple was rebuilt, it wasn't filled with the glory of God in the same visible way that the first temple had been and that the tabernacle had been. So these words of Haggai are a vision for a future that has not yet happened, an eschatological temple. And when we looked at the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel has a very protracted vision, very extended vision of an eschatological temple. And I spoke at some length about the fact that we need to understand this as eschatological, as a metaphor for something that God is going to do in the end times, and not as a physical thing that we need to actually rebuild. And it's very important in geopolitical terms that we get our theology right on this matter. So Haggai also is part of this eschatological trajectory that understands something about a temple which is yet to come, which will be filled with the tribute of the nations and with the glory of God. And as part of this eschatological vision, then, he sees a messianic figure who will rule over the nations. Now, this figure is called Zerubbabel. This is right at the end of the book, verse 21 of chapter 2. Now, Zerubbabel was in the Davidic line. He had a claim to the Davidic kingship if the kingship had still been in existence. But of course it isn't, because the kings have all been deposed by Babylon. But Zerubbabel is picked up in a word that is kind of partly related to the man himself and the authority which he is supposed to wield, although Zerubbabel actually never really does, and he's probably murdered, although that kind of takes place off screen and we're not quite sure what happens to him. So it may be kind of partly a word for him, but also partly a bigger picture, I think, about a restoration of the Davidic monarchy, which we know from the other places where we have seen this is a reaching forward to the Messiah figure who will rule the nations. So what can we notice from this prophecy? Well, I think his call to a people who have become indolent, who have lost their inertia, have lost their energy, who've gained a lot of inertia now, who have become apathetic. This is a kind of timeless call in many ways to the people of God. The crisis of the exile has passed, and the excitement, the initial zeal of their return from exile has also ebbed away, and spiritual life is burning low, and Haggai's task is to rekindle that, which he does quite effectively. There's a particularly interesting little verse in chapter 2, verse 5, which says this. Well, just going back to halfway through the previous verse. I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts, according to the covenant I made with you when you came out of Egypt. So Haggai, as many of the prophets, is reminding the people of the Exodus, is reminding the people of the covenant. But then he goes on to say, my spirit remains in your midst, fear not. So we get this sense that it is the Spirit of God who is the guarantor of the covenant, and is the means by which God is with his people. Now, this is a theme which is going to be picked up very much in the New Testament, and the Apostle Paul certainly understands the Spirit as the guarantor of God's covenant with his people. But you read it here first in Haggai. And the other thing that is very striking about Haggai's prophecy is his emphasis on the word of the Lord. Now, most prophets tend to, they preface an oracle with, here's a vision that I saw, that God gave me, or here is the word of the Lord. But Haggai weaves that language through in his entire prophecy. I'll give you an example from chapter 2. So in verse 1, the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet. In verse 4, we see it twice. Be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord. Verse 6, for thus says the Lord of hosts. Verse 8, the silver is mine and the gold is mine, declares the Lord of hosts. Verse 9, the latter glory of this house shall be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts. And in this place I will give peace, declares the Lord of hosts. So Haggai is in no doubt at all that the message he is delivering is God's message, and he makes that very, very clear in his prophecy. There's something lovely here about this emphasis on the word of the Lord. You may remember in the book of Jeremiah, we had that story of the king who tried to burn up the scroll of the Lord, and then Jeremiah just says, well, we'll write it out again. And although he doesn't exactly say this, the implication clearly is because the word of the Lord endures forever. And here Haggai has this emphasis on the word of the Lord and its importance, its significance, and its value.